Today, when we're brewing our beer, we'll be following the highlighted steps. I'd like to talk a little bit about why we're doing each step and some of the chemistry behind it. The first step involves steeping specialty grains to extract the color and flavor from their husk as they're dissolved into the water. Now, the reason we're keeping the temperature below 170 degrees is to prevent the tannins from being extracted, which will produce an undesired flavor into the beer. In step number 2, we'll be adding the malted extract. Now, the malted extract is necessary because it provides the sugars and starches that the yeast needs to react with later on. The next step involves adding the hops at specified intervals in the recipe. In our recipe, the hops are added at the 6-minute mark, which is the start of the boil, at the 15-minute mark, and at the very end. The early hops add a bitterness to the beer due to the isomerization of alpha acids to isoalpha acids. The hops that are added later create a hoppy aroma due to the essential oils found in the hops. Now, this aroma diminishes if they're boiled for too long, so that's why they're added at the end. The fourth step involves sanitizing all your equipment before the fermentation process begins. So this is because you don't want any kind of outside bacteria during the fermentation process. In step 6, you're just diluting your wort to create a 5-gallon batch. The rest of the steps, especially steps 7 and 8, will be covered a lot more in depth once we get to that process in the video. Before we get started, let's take a look at some of the equipment and ingredients that are going to be used today. We start off to the left, we have a floating thermometer. Next to that, we have the hydrometer that is going to be used to measure the specific gravity at different points of the brewing process, and that's going to give us our alcohol content of the beer. Here we have the measuring cylinder that the hydrometer is going to be used with. The copper coil. This copper coil is going to be used to cool down the wort before the yeast is pitched. We also have some beer to enjoy during our beer brewing experience. Next, we have the fermentation bucket with the airlock installed, a carboy, some water used for making the wort. Here we have the ingredients. To the right, you have the malts, and then you have your specialty grains in the bag, your hops, your yeast, and the liquid malt extract. We also have a siphon for transferring the liquid and a stirring spoon. Down here, you'll see a digital thermometer, and that's going to tell us the temperature of our wort during each stage of the process. And here is our brewing pan and our burner, and that covers just about everything. As you can see now, our water temperature is at 160 degrees Fahrenheit, and I have our bag of grains steeping in the water. That'll steep here for about 20 to 30 minutes. Now that my grains have steeped in the 160 degree water for 25 minutes, I put the grain bag in a strainer and poured 170 degree water over top of it just to rinse anything else off the grains. I also added another 2 gallons of water to the pot to make a total of 5 gallons. Next, I added the liquid malt extract to the pot, thus creating the wort. My next step is to bring this all to a boil. Once my wort comes to a boil, I'll start to add my hops. And I'll add hops at 3 different points. I'll start off with 2 ounces of hops as soon as it comes to a boil at the 60-minute mark. Then at the 15-minute mark, I'll add a half ounce of hops. And then at the very end, I will add the last half ounce of hops. And as I showed you earlier in the video, these are the hops that I'm going to be using. Just giving an update on where we're at now. The wort has been boiling for about 40 minutes. As soon as it started boiling, we added 2 ounces of hops into the wort. And now, the recipe says that we need to add another ½ ounce of hops, and I have that laid out here. We're also going to add 1 teaspoon of Irish moss, and that has been hydrating in water just to make it work a little bit better before we add it. Now we'll go ahead and add these to the boil and let it boil for another 15 minutes, and then I'll be back to add the last ½ ounce of hops. Now that the wort has boiled for the full 60 minutes, it's time to transfer it into the fermentation bucket you'll see here. I'll do so by pouring it through the strainer. Secondly, you can see in the bottom of the fermentation bucket there's a bag, and that bag contains the last bit of hops, the last ½ ounce for the dry hopping, and that'll stay in there until the next stage. For this next part, I need to reduce the temperature of the wort down to about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Looking at my floating thermometer here, it's currently at about 145. Instead of waiting for a long time for that to cool down to the 70 degrees, that is why I have the copper coil here, and I'll be running cold water through the coil to reduce the temperature down a little bit faster. One of the final steps for today is to pitch the yeast. Now that the wort temperature is down to around 75 degrees. Anything higher than 80 degrees could kill the yeast and would ruin the beer. Now we install the lid with the airlock on top, and we'll get into what the airlock is exactly for and the next stage. The beer has been sitting in the fermentation bucket for about a day and a half now. When we take a closer look at the airlock, we can see it bubbling. To understand why this is happening, let's take a look at the chemistry aspect behind it. During the second step of our brewing process, we added the liquid malt extract, which contained the glucose. Then, in the 7th step of the process, we pitched the yeast. This created a chemical reaction, creating ethanol and carbon dioxide. Now, the carbon dioxide is what you're seeing off-gassing from the airlock. When the bubbling stops, it'll be transferred to the carboy. Transferring the beer into the carboy allows you to separate the beer from the sludge at the bottom of the primary fermenter. This includes the yeast sediments, hop sediments, and grains and tannins left over from the mash. The color of the beer is also a little bit different than the beer that we brewed, and that's because this image was taken from a prior batch to save time. After another 14 days of fermentation, it's time to bottle your beer. Again, you want to make sure all your bottles and everything are sanitized for this process. And after bottling, your beer will age for another 2 weeks. I hope you have found this informative, and thank you for watching my video.